Welcome, this is a wee video in order to help you understand Design and Visual Communication or graphics, Achievement Standard AS91340, which is to use the characteristics of a design movement or era to inform your own design ideas. And obviously this student has used Gray Organchi, and they are a modern architecture firm. First thing to look at is that this student has discussed the influence that the architect has used and taken on into their own designs. So we can see they've used Mies van der Rohe and Frank Lloyd Wright, and it's very important that you reference the designer that has gone beforehand. The next thing to look at is that this student has decided to use some images here of the architect's famous work. What this allows the viewer to do, and anyone assessing it, is see directly what the architect is on about, what sort of elements they use. For example, we can see very clearly that this architect uses a box form or a grid. We've got lots of cantilever and has a very sort of modern architectural style that we can observe in other architects. A very easy way in order to be able to link who the architect you've chosen and their influences are to compare and contrast. As we can see here, we have the architect's own design and who they were influenced by. In this case, Mies van der Rohe. Over here we have the Quarry House by the designer and Frank Lloyd Wright's home and studio. So we've got the architect you've chosen and we've got the architect or work they were influenced by. Very, very clear to see the compare and contrast. The next most important thing to do is to look at the elements, design elements that both designers have used. If we look at what the student has written, they've referred to proportion and rectangles. We've also got large wall length windows in order to make the space seem open and larger than it really is. So we've identified two elements now. Also, we can look at the fact that the buildings have prominent borders surrounding the large windows, which create the horizontal and vertical line patterns. The student has linked these to the modernist style. So we've talked about kind of the era that the artists and designers operate in. Another thing to look at is the fact that there is a reference to the fact that both of these designers eliminate or basically don't use any unnecessary detail, so that the houses are quite clean, and that is the main characteristics of the modernist style. Don't put extra detail in. So I think the student has made it very clear just from that first paragraph that there are key ideas that both artists or designers use, and this is a great technique in terms of setting up what you are going to design. Once you've identified those elements, it is very easy to commence sketching and start thinking what are the elements that I'm meant to be replicating. Over here the student has compared and contrasted Frank Lloyd Wright's work, which is this one here, and Gray Organchi's own Quarry House. One of the main things to look at is that both of these buildings or structures have organic architecture. That means that there is nature in both of these designs. So once again, comparing and contrasting, well, the comparison is that they have similarities. They both use that organic architecture, the buildings fit into nature. On the student's second page, they've discussed the era that Gray Organchi works in, and obviously it's a modern architect, therefore they're working in the 21st century. The main movement that modern architects are using these days are integrating natural materials into their designs, which of course was the previous slide we talked about. What the student goes on to say is that most modern architects these days, those that are cutting edge or leading architects, are always thinking about ways of maybe restoring or adding to old buildings, or they're looking at using new, green, environmentally friendly technologies. So the whole idea of reuse, recycle, and also don't leave too much of an impact on the planet. So what you're going to have to do is decide what the overall era is that your architect is designing in. If it's a modern one, it makes sense to look into this modernist approach. The student has gone on to explain the elements that we talked about in the first slide in further detail, in regards to looking at, they both use the prairie style, which is horizontal lines, and both architects use wood or other natural materials. So once again, just further expanding the similarities that both designers use. What the student has done there when they discuss the philosophy of the architect is they've looked at probably a quote, I would think, from a website from the actual architect. In this case, it says the technical, physical and economic demands of a project give force and clarity to the language of architecture. In other words, if there are constraints to the brief, this is actually going to help give the design a bit of clarity. You've got to work within your constraints. That's the basic philosophy. Over here the student has talked about some specific works by Gray Organishi. In this case, the daycare centre, storage barn and church house. And the fundamental thing that all of these buildings have in common is that they use natural materials. Once again, that's what their influences use. And we go on to further discuss the eco-friendly heating, for example, the photovoltaic panels, and the fact that it's energy efficient. So once again, not stuffing up the environment. That's pretty important for both designers. There's also a little bit of a commentary by the student talking about why they think the design was successful, because it looks balanced, and that the design was well thought out, which you may want to do if you have opinions, as long as you're justifying it. Finally, we have the third page, which talks about Gray Organishi's impact on society. This is a pretty good designer to talk about in terms of impact on society. I guess this architect hasn't necessarily changed the way people view houses, but once again, this architect is trying to have the least amount of impact on the environment, and the student has discussed the fact that this designer makes energy efficient homes at world-class standards, and they consider what the requirements are of the climate. You're going to need to ask yourself, what impact has my architect or designer had on society? Is the influence more of an aesthetic decision? Is it the look of the house, or is it more of a philosophy of the environment, materials used, etc.? The final thing to look at is the fact that the student has done a bibliography. So in order to get rid of any chance that you've plagiarised the work, you're going to want to have a bibliography, so anybody assessing the work you've done can check up on that bibliography and check that you wholesale haven't copy-pasted, which of course you cannot do for NCA and shouldn't do any time. The most fundamental thing is that anything that you get off the internet, you've quoted, and wherever possible, put it into your own words, and that's the best way of being able to show an assessor that you understand what you're talking about. So hopefully you found that quite sort of clear as to what you need to do. So we've got 3 pages there. We've unpicked both designers' work, and when we begin our sketching and designing of our own designs.